Hey, today I want to talk about Zelda, but I don't just want to explain a game to you or walk you through every little thing or spit interviews in your face. I want to dispel a long-held misconception about one of my favorite games. And most of all, I want to tell you a story. A story about people coming together to rise above the odds and do the impossible. A story about surpassing what came before. A story about a man giving his everything for the people he cares about. I want to tell you the story of The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess.
It's the art style, Aonuma-san. They didn't like it.
Eiji Aonuma has just received an answer that will go on to become infamous. It will be restated in many White Boy Zelda video essays, including this one, for years to come. The story that's often shaped from this event is largely negative, but for Aonuma, the feelings are much more mixed. The Wind Waker was the first Zelda game that really felt like it was under his direct control. By this time, Shigeru Miyamoto was seeding into more of a producer role on the series. Instead of acting as the architect, he now functioned as a steward, making sure Zelda didn't stray too far from itself. For Aonuma, it was much appreciated breathing room. Miyamoto is the type of person so stubborn that it can feel impossible to change his mind, meaning it was often difficult for the team on Zelda games to bring their vision to fruition without immense scrutiny and restructuring. If it wasn't done the way Miyamoto wanted to the letter, it wasn't done. But, now facing the other edge of the sword, Aonuma was handed the reins to one of the flagship series of his company. He poured his heart and soul into the project, and the final product was something he thought he was happy with. And now he was being told that a whole group of people hated his work. I don't think we'll ever know exactly how this affected him, but if there's one thing I do know, it's that Eiji Aonuma was not the type of man to sit around and sulk about it. The Zelda team understood exactly the monument they had made in Ocarina of Time, and after Majora's Mask, Aonuma wanted to take the series in a new direction. But now, given the news that his pivot was ineffective, Aonuma was faced with a choice. He had been running from the dragon that was Ocarina of Time. This was still in a time period where Ocarina's amazing qualities were discussed far more than its flaws. It was the perfect game. Eiji Aonuma, faced with the news that fans wanted a return to form, looked to face the insurmountable beast that stood before him. Taking on this task would mean improving on the greatest achievement in gaming. It would mean doing something impossible. A boy from a podunk village is about to embark on the biggest quest of his life. But as for right now, he's just a farmhand. This is the premise for the intro to Twilight Princess. Like most Zelda games, the scale starts small, but unlike most, Twilight Princess makes the choice to linger on this premise. And because it hangs on this premise, it ends up, in my opinion, doing something extremely interesting. In Ocarina of Time, Link feels like an outsider to the community of the Kokiri. He's an orphaned Hylian. He's out of place. The Kokiri don't talk to him like they know him. He's asked on the quest to help the Great Deku Tree because he isn't a Kokiri. This setup works because Link's unburdened. It's easier for this Link to drop everything and go save the world, because he doesn't have anything to leave behind. He's a good vessel for the player. Twilight Princess stands in complete contrast. Everyone in the village knows Link by name and treats him like a member of the community. This Link has friends, acquaintances, a more direct love interest, and even a job. This Link is content living the quiet life, finding fulfillment in helping the people around him. He's a worse vessel for the player, but he's a much more interesting character. He's not spurred to action by a sense of destiny or a search for greater purpose. He's pulled into heroics by happenstance. His hand is forced because he cares about the people around him, and this allows him to find himself. This was evidently an idea that someone on the Zelda team was very fond of. The driving force in Wind Waker was much the same. Link didn't care about saving Hyrule at the start. He was just trying to save his sister, who happened to get kidnapped by the Helmrock King. But, while in my opinion Wind Waker used this setup to create its adventure-obsessed world, Twilight Princess took this setup and grew fascinated by it. However, more specifically than the game, I think Mitsuhiro Takanao, Aya Kyogoku, and Takayuki Ikaku put together the pieces of a really interesting story. Insights on Twilight Princess's story development are more scarce than other aspects. This is, in part, due to the nature of story in Zelda. The Legend of Zelda is a series that is designed gameplay first. When speaking on the story, the staff talk about it as something to facilitate the gameplay and adventure. It's a tool to put the players in unique places and gameplay scenarios. It's not unimportant, but rather intentionally limited. If you haven't watched The Question No One Asks Shigeru Miyamoto, first of all, you should. It's one of the best videos on YouTube. But the video discusses an interesting through line from Miyamoto's interviews, the idea of a miniature garden. I'm not going to go too in-depth, but I'll leave an annotation on screen for those of you who wish to learn more. The miniature garden idea is about leaving you a self-contained play space, somewhere you can allow your imagination to run wild. Miyamoto is routinely obsessed with creating a game that rewards you for being imaginative, or going out of your way and taking the time to do something that in any other game would be pointless. And nothing, to me at least, illustrates this point better than this quote. If we don't put enough of these things in the game, Miyamoto-san will always notice it and send an email saying something like, "I went to all the trouble of trying this in the game, and I was sad because I didn't get a new reaction from any of the characters in the game." I called these his sob story emails. As you might be able to guess, this isn't conducive to a great or particularly deep story. It's extremely hard to write an effective and compelling story and simultaneously give the player as much freedom as Miyamoto aspires to, which is likely why whenever games do manage to succeed at this, they're often generation-defining titles that are marveled for long reaches of time. For a while, I've found each part of Twilight Princess's intro fascinating. The game does so much to establish Link as a person, and it originally made me think that the story must have been the next thing in line for development after the general aesthetic. It's a logical conclusion, at least I thought. A game's visuals are made in relation to its themes, but as it turns out, I couldn't have been more wrong.
Takanao-san, you worked on bringing together the outline of the story to a certain extent, so I think you were probably conscientious about understanding the bigger picture from an early stage. Wasn't that a lot of work for you this time around? Well, the plots of Zelda games have always been broadly outlined by the director at the beginning. Then, each time a new and interesting gameplay element is devised, something is later added to the story to accommodate it. So the emphasis isn't put on story at the beginning? Not at all. It's never been done like that.
There's a continued sense in this interview conducted by the late Satoru Iwata with members of the Twilight Princess team of the story serving a more utilitarian purpose. The story serves to facilitate the player's experience. This honestly threw me for a loop when I was first researching and writing this script. I went in with so many preconceptions as to how a more linear game like this came about, only to be told that it was the dead opposite of what I thought. The Zelda game that I revered for its story, respected for its ability to put story first when it needed to, didn't care any more about its story than the games with more emphasis on freedom. And all of that thought led me right here. Thinking about how something like this could be formulated in such a strange way. And it started to lead me to looking more at the people behind the project. Development for Twilight Princess is now underway. Aonuma delivered the news of his decision to a room of shocked colleagues. He wanted to try and outdo Ocarina of Time. At first, the room was much of what you'd expect. The team was shocked and surprised. The Zelda team had always prided themselves on innovating with each game and delivering players a unique experience. And now, not only were they supposed to look back, but they had to top their masterpiece. Eventually, though, as the shock faded, a new feeling began to develop throughout the room. Excitement. For a lot of the team, this was a chance to top the best project they had ever worked on, and for others, it was a chance to pay gratitude to an amazing experience and work alongside the folks who made it. And work they did. If you ask 100 people what Zelda is, you'll get 100 different answers. And at this point in development, 99 of those answers haven't been implemented yet, but something that notably has been implemented is fighting while on horseback. Yeah, I feel like the sentiment towards this feature was surprisingly positive compared to my memories and experiences, but as it turns out, that's for good reason. When the Zelda team was faced with the idea of doing the things they couldn't do in Ocarina of Time, initially the first thing they thought of was horseback combat. As it turns out, convincingly giving the player the feeling of riding a horse is not very easy, and allowing them to fight while on that horse is way harder. If you've played Twilight Princess, you probably get what I mean. Fighting on horseback isn't exactly the smoothest experience, but it's fun and definitely unique. It does feel convincing, which is because the devs who were responsible for the horses, at the recommendation of Miyamoto, went and rode horses. You can even see a special thanks for the ranch in the credits. I don't think they jousted with one another on a bridge with flaming pyres at their backs, but otherwise, they definitely did their research. I think this really does tell us a lot about the mindset of the folks working on this game. Even with the failure of Wind Waker still on their minds, or maybe in spite of it, it feels really like not a single person worked on this game with any less than everything they had. People were so passionate, in fact, that team meetings were often marked by arguments. Like I said, 100 different people, 100 different ideas of what Zelda is, and that means 100 different thoughts about what this Zelda should be. As I've continued writing and reading, a lot of reading, with no dark mode, my eyes, I've slowly started to figure out the answer to my question. I think the passion of the people behind the project is puzzle piece number 1, let's say, of how this story came about. It might not make total sense quite yet, but I'm hoping that I can provide that same gradual build to a moment of clarity that felt so great to me, to you. And speaking of puzzle pieces, let's talk about the next thing I read that really threw me for a loop. I can't speak for the developers, obviously, but these interviews make it feel like a dream job. They talk as if everybody contributed, not only in their defined roles, but in their ideas as well. Twilight Princess was the type of project that just kept growing. It got to the point where the team had to cram new mechanics and ideas into existing space everywhere possible just to prevent the project from getting out of hand. Although that's not to say that it didn't get out of hand. Twilight Princess grew so much past its original vision that the release of the game was delayed by a year. Yeah, the game wasn't ready, and they actually delayed it instead of releasing a broken mess. Better times, man. Better times. In an interview with the devs, Iwata mentioned he was worried that the delay would have the effect of moving the finish line at the end of the race. It's a fair thing to be worried about. A delay like this can be a big hit to motivation. But the developers seemed to generally be more relieved than demoralized. It gave them time to polish all of the odds and ends they had been chalking the game full of. I think this is one of the biggest things that speaks to the dev team's passion. The fact that they had to delay the game, not because it was underdeveloped, but because they had added too much, really speaks to the insane amount of love that went into this game. Getting back to my question. At this point in my research and understanding, I was even more confused. Not only was this Zelda not made to be more story-focused, but the gameplay grew so much that it very likely outpaced the framework that Aonuma had laid out in the first place. How did a game like this end up with a stronger narrative than everything else in the series? It's so crazy to think about how rigid the game looks from an outside perspective compared to how fluidly the devs seem to have treated it. And then it hit me. The dungeons in Twilight Princess are hitter. Whew. Oh, I'm gonna catch some heat for this. Okay, alright. I got this. The dungeons in Twilight Princess are hit or miss. It's weird, because the ones that are good are the ones you would expect to suck, like the Water Temple. And the ones that are usually an easy tap-in, like the Fire Temple. Man, what a cool emote that's really relevant to the video. If only there was a place where you could get stuff like this and more. That would be pretty cool, huh? You could also see, maybe, I don't know, some video clips of me and my friends doing stuff like this. This is the freaking code! Why is that the code? This.
What the fuck's cat is that?
Yeah, whose cat is on the mic? Is that Toph? Is Toph in voice chat? Toph's in voice chat. I bet. Yeah, it is. You fuck. And this.
What the
fuck? Wait, he got the dogs out. What the fuck?
Put those away, bro. Please.
Or even catch the streams live. Wouldn't that be neat? Follow me on Twitch, please, for the love of God. The ones that are usually an easy tap-in, like the Fire Temple, it's good if you use a gecko code to speed up the Iron Boots walking speed and skip half the dungeon. Don't crucify me, don't crucify me, don't crucify me, don't crucify me. Strangely though, while the dungeons are memorable in their own right, Twilight Princess actually creates its more interesting experiences in between the dungeons. Sometimes for better, and sometimes for worse. Either way though, there are so many things that happen in Twilight Princess. When the game isn't slowing itself to a crawl, it feels like there's something new every moment. It's clear that many of these amazing set pieces are those extra ideas Aonuma was talking about cramming into the game. This, I think, is the backswing, so to speak, of our answer. To illustrate what I mean, let's use an analogy. This is a tower from a game of Jenga. Right now it's quite tall and it's also quite wobbly. There's quite a few gaps throughout that allow the tower to wiggle and flex without falling over. But if we start taking the pieces from the top and bringing them down, filling in those gaps, the tower gets a lot more rigid. There's less room for it to bend. This is, I think, what happened. The dev team filled so many gaps that the game had to be experienced in such a linear fashion to maintain both the Zelda effect of building on what came before and have the game even make sense in the first place. They had no choice but to make the game more linear. The game is so linear because it had to be. Because there was no other option for a project like this. That should be a satisfying enough answer to my question, but there's still one thing nagging at me. Why this story? Why the story full of introspection and character moments with running themes and full-on characters? Why did the most linear Zelda, the game the Zelda team supposedly never wanted to make, get the most amazing story? We're over the mountain now. It's done. Every bug and creature vanquished, every beast tamed, every house built, every little thing is complete. And at the end of it all, the beast is slain. For Link, a great moment of triumph. His world is safe. Ganon is vanquished. The people of Hyrule can rest. For Aonuma, a great accomplishment. The team has made something that they feel lives up to their goals, and the fans received the product that they asked for. Through delays, through arguments, through many a Miyamoto-ism, the game is done. And small aside, holy shit did people buy it! Aonuma could take joy in the fact that he achieved at least one of the two things he set out to do. Like, holy fuck! As for the other one, whether Twilight Princess is better than Ocarina of Time is contentious. I think Twilight Princess has both higher highs and lower lows. Whether or not it's a better game largely depends on who you ask. For me, those highs are more than enough to justify the pain points, but for others, the pacing, linearity, and inherent derivativeness are too much to put it above some of the greatest games ever made. And honestly, that's fair. I can't earnestly tell you I'm not speaking from a place of nostalgia, and it seems to be all too prevalent of a pattern that a person's favorite Zelda game coincidentally matches their childhood. But even if Twilight Princess still doesn't surpass Ocarina of Time, even if it's derivative and slow and too linear, it's still amazing in its own unique way. Okay, for one final time, how did a story like Twilight Princess's come about? Well, I don't think it was burnout, or depression, or apathy, or any other thing. I think it was love and passion. I think a team of people set out to honor a project that they all held in great regard, pouring everything they had into it and then some. I think Twilight Princess was an anomaly in the Zelda franchise, not because it was a black sheep or because it had to be made, but because it was a game where every member of the team put everything they had into it. Every one of them went that much further. Every one of them put that much work in out of nothing but love. Surrounded by that much passion, I don't think there's anything else that could have happened. So in the end, for me, it's not a question of why this story. It was always going to be this way. Instead, the real question, I think, is why this narrative? I'm not playing the synonym game to try and sound smart, I swear. My favorite video about Twilight Princess literally calls it the game Nintendo never wanted to make, and to me, that's a massive shame. Twilight Princess, like many of us, should be celebrated for what it is, not brushed aside for what it ought to be. Yet nearly everything I see about it either only highlights its flaws or runs with a narrative that paints the development of this game in a far more negative light than it deserves. Twilight Princess isn't the black sheep of the Zelda franchise, or some slave-driven work of commerce. It's a beautiful attempt to honor and surpass a masterwork, a chance for a bunch of people to come together and work earnestly with the simple goal of making something great. So, the next time somebody tries to say Nintendo didn't want to make Twilight Princess, the next time they try to take away from an amazing project made by amazing people, remember this video. Remember the story of a man doing everything he can to make something great. Remember the team that stood behind him, and remember that whoever you're talking to probably gets their opinions off Reddit.com. And then smile at that person and ignore them completely.